Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me properly? Yeah, okay. I'm glad you came at 10 in the morning. It's quite early for a weekend. And we actually don't have a lot of time. These were long introductions. So diving into our questions right away. Priyanka, I'll start with you. The name of your memoir, Bird Milk Mosquito Bones. Neither of, I don't, as far as I know, their mosquitoes have no bones and birds do not give milk. So what's the idea, why pick such a strange title?
Bird milk and mosquito bones is a translation of a Kashmiri phrase, which refers to something. We're big storytellers in Kashmiri tradition. There's also no official written Kashmiri, so we tell a lot of stories orally, lots of tall tales and lots of family stories. And so it refers to something that is so rare and precious that it might be imaginary. And so because the book is so much about the house that we lost in Kashmir, it's also how I refer to the house in my memory, is I loved it so much and it was so precious to me, but did it really exist? Are my memories real? So it kind of plays with that.
And Peter, what does exit wounds mean?
Exit wounds, it's actually in the book too, is when I was at the BBC and we were covering conflict, they would send us on these courses called hostile environment courses, which was supposed to teach us how to stay alive, or at least give us a better chance of surviving. And one of the bits of the course was a very gruesome lecture by a Royal Marine doctor who had this slideshow of various things and various ways you could die in a war zone and how to apparently ameliorate it. And he put up a slide of someone who'd been shot, and you could see the bullet hole in the torso, and it looked small and survivable and whatever. And then the next slide was the back of this person, and of course the whole of the back was gone. And he said, it's not the entry wound that kills you, it's the exit wound that kills you.
Thank you. Now we know what their title means, and both of them actually, in a way, elaborate their titles in both their memoirs. And now I'll go straight into what they've written about and their experiences. Peter, I would start with you again. So you start the book with a Charles Dickens quote, "Life is made of ever so many partings welded together." And Priyanka, another Kashmiri proverb that you start the book with, "A sparrow is content on its own thorny branch." If you could tell me, why would you pick this quote and this proverb? Peter, you first.
I think that, that the genius of the human mind is to try and draw connections and find continuities in situations which really are chaotic and random. We can't stand randomness, so we try and impose some kind of pattern and order on things that are otherwise often sort of unbearably sad or difficult. And in that sense, that's what that's why I used the Dickens thing. You're trying to find these threads in what are, in actual fact, in life, these persistent continuities, and including the foreknowledge of death in a way, which is the ultimate discontinuity.
Priyanka?
For me, my community, Kashmiri Hindu community, was scattered in 89-90, and everyone sort of left for other places. But for 35 years now, we've all yearned for home, even though it's a very complicated place. Even though it's flawed, even though it's been under conflict for so long, I think there's still this yearning for, even though it's an imperfect place, nothing will ever feel as happy to us as our thorny branch. So there's no place like home. That's our way of saying there's no place like home.
Now, going back to your childhood, Peter, you grew up as a white boy in an African country, Zimbabwe. And Priyanka, you moved around a lot from country to country, where now that you have the experiences and the language of an adult, you were an outsider. But as a child, did you feel othered with those around you?
Absolutely. As a white child in a black majority country, you knew very early on that you weren't from there. But I didn't really know, we didn't quite know as kids where we were from. You had this very strange experience where we were sort of brought up in a kind of British culture in terms of education, the books we read, the cultural references we had. But really it was like looking at England through the wrong end of a telescope, insofar as we'd never been to England, us kids. We knew it from books and I guess eventually movies and that kind of thing. And when I did eventually go to England, it was such a strange experience. It seemed so small and wet and cross. Everybody was cross all the time. They sat on the subways and with pinched faces and kind of looked mad at each other. And it was just and in a weird way, it was only when I first went to England, which was as a young adult, I mean, I was 19 or something, that I then realized how African I was. But yet I'm not from Africa. So a lot of my writing ends up looking at that whole cultural confusion in a way, and how you're constantly negotiating your identity and your presence. I've now lived on 3 different continents. And I think, in a way, it's no surprise that I've ended up in New York City, which is just this ultimate place where almost everybody is from somewhere else.
Yeah, I could echo exactly what Peter said. It's almost the same response, is when you don't live in the place that you're from, you're always an outsider. So I don't know anything else. And I found that my community is people who feel the same. Other people who feel displaced, other people who feel like outsiders. It's not an uncomfortable feeling necessarily, because you very quickly get used to you belong everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So it makes it very, you could drop me tomorrow in any country and I'll make friends, I'll make a life, I'll find a supermarket, I'll figure out the rhythms of what my life is supposed to look like. But at the same time, I do have a memory of what it feels like to be in the place where I am from, surrounded by people who are like me. And that can never happen again. Because even my own community, because of the 35 years, we will meet up and we love each other and we're very tight-knit, but each one of us has led a completely different life in a completely different place. So even that commonality is not there, other than food and language and a shared history. So yeah, it's a wonderful, beautiful thing. And there's a little sadness there, but you get used to it.
And still talking about your childhood, Priyanka, one of the more happier bits of the memoir is Priyanka writing about her brother Puneet. And she very frankly admits that she was, I think, more of a mother figure to him than probably your mother was, yeah? Cooking him lunches and packing his tiffin. Yeah, I thought those were the most happier, sweeter bits. And in contrast, Peter's memoir, you see his younger sister, Georgina, who seems to be more grounded and more rational of the you two, maybe, yeah. I at least I felt so. No. But
my sister's in the audience. I know.
But so how does being an older sibling ground you? Does it ground you? I'm a single child, so I wouldn't know.
I mean, we had a strange situation, a tragic situation, because we had an older sister still, our oldest sibling, and she was killed in the war with her fiancé and best man, and she was really the glue that held the family together. And we were all very spaced out, by 10 and 7 years. And also that kind of weird, we were a settler colony, but we had a boarding school tradition. So I was at boarding school by the time I was 6. And my mother was our mother was a very busy rural doctor who had, 1,000, 2,000 square miles. She was the only doctor. And I remember when I was a toddler, she went down on her knees, so she was at eye level with me, and she said, "What I really need you to be is a big boy, is independent." And I went, okay, and off I went to be independent. Of course, I never really saw her again. That was, the sleight of hand was that she had a different vocation, and it wasn't motherhood. She was, and she was the first to admit it. She had something actually more important to do that was more consequential, and we just had to sort of get on with it. And in the book, I wrote that, there is a sort of sad symmetry to what happened, in that I spent the first 10 years of my life trying to get my mother's attention, and she spent the last 10 years of hers trying to get mine.
I joke that my parents brainwashed me into taking care of the baby. They told me it was my idea. They told me it was my idea to have the baby. And then when the baby came, they were like, here's your baby that you wanted. And so I was like, give me that baby. I will take care of him until he's 25, which I absolutely did. I adored him. He was especially moving so much, he was often my only friend, and he was my little sidekick and did whatever I wanted and was just so loving and fun and funny. But I think also they're watching the live stream right now, so if they were here, you could all laugh at them. They were wonderful parents, my parents. They really loved being parents. My father's a pediatrician, which obviously, belies a love for children and enthusiasm about children. My mother was an educator who grew up in a big family who also just adores children. So I was given a lot of love. I was loved very much through all the moves, through all the turmoil. Like what I had was an immense amount of love and attention from my parents. And so when this doll arrived in our house, I was able to pour that love into him. And he was I refer to him as my firstborn, which I guess is a little weird. He's turning 40 now. But yeah, it's a bond that I'm really grateful for, and I could only create because it was what was modeled for me.
Priyanka, you said your father was a pediatrician, and Peter, of course, your mother was an iconic doctor in Zimbabwe. But both of you chose very unconventional careers, and Priyanka, you have written about the anxiety that has sort of followed you in your younger years, because, we Indians are very fascinated by engineering, medical law, you will make a life out of it, but publishing, writing, you're not quite sure. Mm-hmm. And Peter, you lost a sibling to the war. In fact, you were drafted in one. So why would you go back to volatile situations and report on war?
Yes, I mean, to your first point, both our parents were technocrats. Mother was a doctor, our father was an engineer, and none of their children turned out to have any interest or talent for STEM things. We all kind of were useless social, whatever. And my father was deeply disappointed, or at least affected to be, and I started out at university studying law as a compromise, and I was a human rights lawyer for a little bit, but that didn't take. And I became a journalist, and I just remember this constant refrain that he would say to me whenever I sort of came back via home. And I was doing okay as a journalist. I was working for the Sunday Times and for the BBC and things. And he would say, when are you going to get a real job? And he was just constantly, that the sort of technocrats saying, when are you going to get an actual sort of real job? And it was a sort of thing between us. And after he died, and I was going through his stuff, I found a filing cabinet, and I opened it, and he'd meticulously clipped and filed all of my work. But he was proud of me, but somehow I just couldn't quite express it. He was just sort of irascible. As for your second point, that's hard to answer. The truth is that I was a very reluctant war correspondent. I don't actually like that phrase. I don't like the intrinsic glamorization of it or whatever. I ended up covering conflict, but I did it from from regional knowledge, and then when you cover one conflict successfully, then you get sent to the next one, sort of thing. But really, what happened to me, and it's a tribute to what can happen. You can get courses set out for you very early in life without seeing them at the time. Because I was conscripted and spent, a year and a bit in a war as essentially almost a child soldier, a teenager, that was sort of on my resume, and I could never get rid of it. It was I was somehow stereotyped, and so I would much rather have been the opera correspondent or something, or a book reviewer, but that just wasn't where I was sent. And then the more you do, the more that becomes who you are.
I would say I feel the same, in that people always wanted me to talk and write about Kashmir, because when that's the standout point, they're kind of like, anyone can write about a book, but you've had this specific life, and you're like, I live the life. I don't necessarily want to talk about it. But here we are. And as far as the medical science stuff, I think, very quickly, my parents encouraged me to go into medicine, and I too thought medicine was where I was headed. I was a good student, I could have done it, but I think at some point I realized that what they wanted for me was not necessarily just medicine, it was stability, because we had moved so much and we had done so many things, and they just wanted me to have a foothold, a financial stability and just sort of this life stability, job stability, because that is the sort of immigrant process, is like, okay, now that we've brought you here, what life are you going to build from this foundation we've provided? And so I took a very unconventional path, and then I did go to law school, and then I moved to LA to work in Hollywood, which made them very uncomfortable. But I was quite young, and they said, okay, try it out for a year. And then I was a Hollywood agent, and I represented actors, which they kind of hated. They hated it. But then they came to visit. I remember this one visit, because they always say, you can move home, you can do this, you can do that. It's still not too late to go to medical school. I'd already been to law school, and I was like, how many degrees do I need? But they came to visit one time, and they saw me. They came to a screening with me of a movie, and they saw everyone around, all my colleagues in suits, all wearing suits, all with like an office, an expense account, a BlackBerry, and they were like, okay, like this will do. This looks like a real job. I don't know what they thought I was doing. I think they thought I was just like watching movies all day. But once they saw that it had all the trappings of some sort of stability, some sort of track to a future, they were like, okay, fine, you know what you're doing. So that made them happy enough. Of course, I came to writing much later, once I had established a sort of financial foundation for myself.
Priyanka, going back to your childhood, this is a realization you probably had as an adult, is that you say you never got to be a child and that you were quite mature for your age. And of course, you also talked about your family being very loving, and you also had a lot of love to give. But tell us about not being not getting to be a child.
Yeah, I had trouble answering the question. Someone had asked me, when was the last time you felt like a child? And I said, never. I never felt like a child. But then I realized I must have, I must have at some point, maybe when I was very, very small, when I don't remember. But when my memories start, I remember feeling like a small adult trapped in a large, an adult trapped in a small person's body. And that was because I knew too much. I just knew too much. As the first child of people who were striving, in the way that they were students, basically. My mother was finishing her PhD, my father was getting his first job, and so I was in it with them. I was right in it with them as they were figuring it out. And I think very early on, you realize, we're building something. We're not there yet. We're building something. So you're sort of recruited, whether or not, I don't think it was deliberately, but you feel the seriousness of the world and the seriousness of your choices and the seriousness of your parents' choices. And there was a lot of love and a lot of laughter. But yeah, early on I knew things, and then in '89 Kashmir happened and all the other things in the book happened. We were in the Gulf War. And you just say, okay, this is how the world is. So the lightness was not there. My brother had that lightness, and we protected that. I really protected that to make sure we all were like, he shouldn't know too much, because it was really nice to have one family member, who wasn't so serious. But yeah, that's how it was and how it's been.
Peter, in this memoir at least, there are a lot of women characters. There's Helen, and there's Georgina, there's Jen, and then there's your ex-wife, Joanna. And you were taught very early on to not be too sentimental, at least not show your emotions, very clearly. So when I was reading it, I thought, you couldn't be a stoic, right? And I thought all these women were sort of your emotional tethers to whatever else was going on in your life. So tell me about having these women around you and the profound impact they had on your growing up years and even your adulthood.
Yes, I grew up among strong women, and I think it really influenced me. It's sort of, those are the women I'm drawn to in all aspects, and the women I mostly see. And I think that from my mother to both sisters and my ex-wife, and it's more surprising in the sense that the society I grew up in was a very, very was a kind of male-oriented, macho, somewhat misogynistic place. But I realized early on that when my mother put on her white coat, she had a white coat and a stethoscope, and she smelled of disinfectant and not perfume, and that, and I spent a lot of time helping her, translating for her and whatever, and it sort of never occurred to me that women were less than men. I mean, it just, and it's not because I was more evolved or anything, it's really just about modeling, I think, and then you never really get rid of that. That stays with you for the rest of your life. And I think, whatever else their marriage was, my parents were very close. They had emigrated to Africa after the Second World War, and they had gone to the most remote part of Zimbabwe on the Mozambique border. And there really weren't very many people of any description around there. It was lightly populated, and they were very sort of they were a kind of unit. In fact, they were so much of a unit that as kids we felt slightly excluded. They had their relationship, and then we were sort of bouncing around to and from boarding school and whatever. So yeah, and I think that what it did to me eventually is make me realize that hinterlands aren't so much about geography. They're not physical. I mean, they are a bit, but they're really about people. They're about family and extended family. And that for us, we didn't have a big family. We didn't have an extended family. And that in a way, I mean, one of the main reasons I wrote Exit Wounds, which embarrassingly somewhat is my third memoir, when someone said, "Why are you still writing memoirs?" And I sort of said, "Because why do research when you can do me-search?" But we were talking earlier about the difference. I teach writing, and the difference between memoir and autobiography. And in our defense, memoir is not sort of, I mean, if you use a televisual metaphor, in an autobiography, you're the reporter and you're standing in front of the camera and you're saying, "Here I am reporting from blah, blah, blah." And if the camera were to move a bit, you would move to get in front of it again. As a memoirist, the camera's on your shoulder and you're pointing at things you're interested in, and you're giving the guide track saying, "Check this out." You're the safari guide of wherever you are. But you're not trying to be in the lens all the time. It's sort of different. And I think that, that in a way, the reason I wrote this third memoir is that I found myself, at 60, it really covers the last year of my mother's life, where that's a sort of curtain rail across the top of the book. And our mother did a really strange thing when she turned 90. Her voice changed. She woke up one morning, and normally she spoke in an accent that we call received pronunciation, which is sort of BBC English, kind of, blah, blah, blah. But although only 6% of Brits actually speak like that, the privately educated, basically. And she was an unremarkable voice, and she suddenly woke up one morning and started speaking this incredibly plummy voice, a sort of haute Edwardian aristocratic drawl. And we were like, "Why are you talking like this?" And also, the timbre of her voice changed. It was like it was a voice of a stranger. And she said, and I said, "Even the Queen has brought it down a notch. Why are you talking like this?" And she goes, "I've always talked like this." And Georgina and I were like, anyway, she said she denied that she talked, and she wasn't having dementia or anything. I've subsequently, I mean, the book is not Oliver Sacks. I'm not trying to do a neurological kind of adventure, but it was, in a way, it's a sort of, we try and follow where this voice has come from, and it's a sort of quest to look back at that. And it turns out, I mean, in a long-winded way to answer your question, that voice is the voice of that as a little girl she spoke like that she'd gone. It's called disinhibition syndrome, and it's sort of all the things that you impose on yourself, you slowly when you get elderly, it's harder to do. And so she'd reverted to her sort of 11-year-old self.
You actually answered a part of another question I wanted to ask. At what point in your life do you, you feel you need to tell your story? Like Peter, you said you wanted to write about your mother. You did answer my question. Priyanka, what about you? Why did you feel the need to tell the story, and why at this point in life?
I I had avoided speaking about Kashmir, writing about Kashmir, talking about Kashmir. I just wanted to, it had been such a big conversation in my life where everything had turned into a fight about politics, let's talk about, it was just very painful. It was a very painful subject. And then a few years ago, something had happened in Kashmir, some sort of clash, and I was just so sick of all the headlines being about what we had lost, because I remembered what we had loved. And so I wrote an essay. I just sat down and wrote it on my computer that was about the summers that I loved being in Kashmir and what I remember from the runner beans in the garden and hanging out with my grandmother and the weddings and like everything I loved and everything I missed and everything we all loved and missed about this place that is never spoken about in loving terms, other than it's very beautiful. Okay, it's beautiful, but there's more there. There's people there. And so I wrote this essay. And I sent it to the New York Times as an op-ed, and they printed it, and it just felt like a weight had lifted. And I was ready to talk about it again because I had found a lens. I was like, I'm not going to report on what has happened. I'm just going to tell you my experience. I'm going to tell you the story of one family in hopes that you can understand who we are as a culture. I wrote it for my community, 100%. And it's resonating with the community and others in a really nice way because these are not stories they've heard before from this sort of like, we've been pitied from afar, we've been in this glass jar, this kind of like ruined Victorian bride, we've been referred to. There's been a lot of conflict in the region for a long time, but there are beautiful, beautiful things that come out of the conflict, and I really wanted to make sure, it was really important to me to have a book where I could say, look, we existed, we laughed, we loved, we did all these things, we weren't just victims of our fate. So it all just kind of came out,
And another very, I think, light-hearted, interesting bits in your book, Peter, is some superstitions that your mother believed in, and Priyanka, the astrology that all the women you tracked down, some of them a bit cuckoo, yeah? So tell us about, I'm sure both of you are very logical people, but tell us about believing in astrology and superstitions.
Well, yeah, our mother came from a line of Church of England vicars in her family. They were church people, and but because she did the bulk of her practice in very rural, very traditional Africa, Zimbabwe, she dealt with traditional healers all the time, and they had a kind of range war at one point. It was and she brokered us a deal basically in the end, which was she would say to them, you have to send me patients that you can't cure, who've got, medical things, and I'll send you my psychiatric cases. Essentially, that was the deal. But then we noticed, once she moved to London, and she came to London only as an elderly person after our father had died, and sort of reluctantly. You have to bear in mind, and what we both have in common here for different reasons is that the country I grew up in doesn't exist. It doesn't exist on many levels. Good and bad. It doesn't exist because it's not a white-ruled minority state. That stopped in 1980, although our family were always white liberals. They supported that. That wasn't the issue. But then after that, for those of you who don't know much about Zimbabwe, it sort of became a failed state. And in the end, it had hyperinflation that was halving the value of the Zimbabwe dollar, every day, every week. And so everybody lost all of their pensions, all of their savings, everything. It was just gone. And so in old age, they were reduced to nothing. After Dad died, and our mother came to live with Georgina in London, and she didn't recognize Britain, and she absolutely didn't recognize it, and she was sort of slightly appalled by it. But we noticed in her later days, she had absorbed this cultural transfer, went both ways. It's quite interesting. People write a lot about how colonizers affect the colony, the people they're colonizing. But the opposite is also true, and it's not talked about as much, not just sort of linguistically, and also but culturally and religiously, and in many ways it is a two-way thing. And she, for example, she believed in this. They're called tokoloshes. They're like little imps. They're in African folklore, and they can jump up on your bed and they're mischievous. They're like, what are those leprechauns? Sort of like an Irish, African leprechaun. And what you have to do is you have to put the legs of your beds in little tins of water, because apparently tokoloshas are hydrophobic and they don't want, so she was convinced that there were tokoloshas coming on her bed, and so we had to tell her, no, we've put these tins on the thing, which we hadn't done, but we told her that, and she was, oh, okay, then she's fine. So she did believe. It was quite interesting. She'd obviously absorbed a lot of that culture over 50 years of practice in rural Africa.
My relationship to astrology is best defined by something my husband said, which is, he said, I don't believe in it, but I do enjoy it. And my feeling about astrologers in general, which I go into in great depth in one chapter of my book, is I love when people love something. Anyone loves anything, I will ask them a million questions about it. So I will get in, I won't believe necessarily, but I am happy to have a conversation about why they believe. I love that. I love hearing about. So that's my feeling about astrology, which I know can be very, my mother takes it all very seriously, the star charts and all that. She's, more religious than I am. But as far as superstition, I will say, if I had a religion growing up, it was common sense. We lived in too many places for me to adhere to any one thing. But the superstition, my mother's a very superstitious person, so she will call me and say, okay, before you leave you can move into the house on this date. You can this can happen on this date. And I'm like, okay, wherever you're getting this. And then I read a very interesting study, which I'm working into my next book, it's a classic psychological study by B.F. Skinner called Superstition in the Pigeon. And Superstition in the Pigeon, he put a bunch of pigeons in a cage, and he gave them a little food tab, right? And so they would, and it came out randomly, completely randomly, the food. But the pigeons started thinking that the little wiggles and dances they were doing was making the food come. So they would repeat the dances and the head nods and the steps and whatever, and then wait for the food, thinking, okay, now I've created a situation where food is going to arrive. And I think of superstition all the time like this. It's an anxiety management tool. The waiting is very difficult, but if you feel like by opening this, holding onto this, putting this, burning this, you can affect an outcome, it's how people deal with uncertainty. So that I think I have a lot of empathy for. So while I can roll my eyes and think it's a little silly, I also go, these are the small things that comfort us, especially as, displaced communities.
My final question before we open the floor for questions. Peter, you have written 3 memoirs, and you have 2 children, and your father was famously not a very open person, right? But you are quite literally an open book. So do you worry that your children might know too much about you? I don't think any of us want to know our parents too well.
What was it Churchill said? No man is a hero to his valet. I did something with my kids that I hadn't experienced, which is that I was a very hands-on parent. I was the primary parent. That was circumstantial, and it was such fun. I was talking to a friend of mine who was a pediatric shrink when my oldest son decided he might want to go to boarding school, and I'd been to horrible Dickensian boarding schools and was felt a bit miffed about it. And he listened to me whine on for a bit, and he looked at me and he said, well, that's all very well. He said, just remember to parent the child you've got and not the child you were, which is true, but kind of irritating. This gets into the whole subject of what we face as memoirists, writing about families, and how do you do that and not alienate them and piss them off and break the family up and whatever. And in our experience, my experience certainly, I don't write things they don't want. They get to read it. They get to veto things that are about them. I wouldn't, if they didn't want to be in the book, I wouldn't write about them. I wouldn't have them in there. And I don't write about them now. I write about them when they're just little, before they have full agency. And so, but with my parents, when I wrote my first book, and I sent it to them and said, and Zimbabwe was politically charged, and they were somewhat vulnerable. And I said, you can have power veto over things. And it was before email, and I was waiting and waiting and waiting, and the publisher was saying, we need to get this book out. So I reprinted the manuscript, and I went through with a blue pen, and I thought, I am them. I'm going to think myself into their position. What pisses me off about this book? And I said, that's not... And just as I got to the end, their marked-up version arrived, and I put the two next to each other, and there wasn't a single overlap. I got everything wrong. And I thought, wow. And it just, because what I was doing was, in fact, I was doing that thing where people say, if I were you, but they're really, but you're sort of still you, but you're putting yourself in their position, but with your filter. And they were, they just had different issues. And luckily, they were so small. I was like, yay, I wouldn't want, I wouldn't write stuff that people didn't want. And in fact, we were talking earlier, my books, after my sister was killed, our family, the lights went out behind my parents' eyes. They were just devastated. And for years. And that first memoir, and because we were sort of, kind of colonial Britain, whatever, we weren't touchy-feely. As you said, we weren't sentimental. That was considered, an indulgence. But somehow, through the artifact of the book, we could talk about stuff that we couldn't talk about directly because it was sort of research for the book. It was triangulated. And so in that sense, I think it actually was constructive and helped to bring us back together as a family.
Thank you, Peter and Priyanka. I had great fun, and I hope you did too. We are ready to take questions. We have quite a few hands. If you could start with the people at front.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your experience. Hi, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I'm a first-generation immigrant too, living in the United States, so I completely get it. So my question for Priyanka is, so was writing the book cathartic for you, and do you think that you found some amount of your home in Kashmir when you did that?
Yes, I felt 100 pounds lighter emotionally. It was very difficult to write. There was a lot of crying and curling into a ball and not sleeping. It was really difficult. And then when it was done, I felt, I said that I've never felt like a child, but I feel now that I'm feeling the lightness maybe that I missed out on when I was younger, because I'm much lighter and happier than I had been, I think, before I wrote it, because I carried this weight and now it's just sort of been set free. So yeah, it's been incredible. It's all for me. It feels very selfish, but and my family too, in the same way. We've talked through the book, and I feel like now we can really talk about anything. It's been wonderful for the family communication.
Good morning. So I'm a Kashmiri too.
Oh.
How have you reconciled to never going back to your land?
That's tricky. I can't go. I haven't been back at all. My parents go back, and they're fine with it. But I think because I was so young when I left, I have a child's pain, and I carry that around. And to go and see the places that I loved, having changed so much, would be too difficult right now. That is not something I've tackled. That is not something I've solved. And people are always like, come, it's safe, and it's this. And I'm like, I'm not ready, and I don't know when I will be. No, it'll never be the same. But it's kind of like it lives with me. It's a sad little creature. A sad little creature that lives with me. It's never going to go anywhere. It'll always be a part of me.
Can you take the mic to that, on the right?
Thanks. Thanks so much. Great session. In response to a wonderful question from Sayari, Priyanka, you said you never felt like a child. Peter, what about you? Did you?
Not really, no. I mean, I'm with her, no. I mean, and also, in a sort of colonial context, the distortion was you were given authority much too young. And so you had adult black people asking you, coming and deferring to you sometimes, which, and I do remember, my parents had zero tolerance for any kind of bad treatment of anybody who worked with us or anyone was near us. And so you were there was a seriousness to you that's too young. And so you didn't really get this period that I saw my boys have, and kind of lived through it vicariously, and thought that's what it's like to actually have a real childhood where you can just run around and whatever. And no, we grew up too quickly. Maybe that's why we end up writing memoirs. You do grow up. You do have a sort of seriousness to you very early on. So no, to answer your question.
Hi, good morning. This is for Peter. I know you don't want to be stereotyped as a war correspondent, but it's something that I'll never know. What's the inner psyche of being a war correspondent? Because frontline war is evolving differently every minute, and how do you get into it?
How do you get
as a correspondent? Yeah, because you don't know what's going to unfold, really, isn't it?
Right. I mean, you mean into it as a career or into a particular war?
As a journalist. Covering it.
I mean, there are lots of journalists who want to do it, and I'm not one of those. I wasn't one of those, and I'm still not one of those. But I've got a horrible feeling that once you do it, you get addicted is a very strong word, and I don't quite mean that. You become used to it, and it's you know how in psychology. They say that you keep repeating the same wrong relationship, and you think, well, surely you've recognized that one, but it's familiar, and so you're drawn to it, even though you should know that it's not good for you. And I never went to therapy because we didn't in our culture. That wasn't a thing. And only now that I'm in New York, which is second only to Vienna in the kind of history of therapy, or Buenos Aires, I'm told, has the highest number of therapists per head of population. But I did, really to process my divorce, I did end up going to therapy. And the therapist kept trying to convince me and saying, oh, you've obviously got PTSD. That's what you've got PTSD. And so I did a lot of reading about PTSD. And the problem is that it seemed to me with the diagnosis was that PTSD generally looks at one sort of traumatic event that you keep reliving, and it's that thing. And that didn't chime with me. It didn't feel quite right. And then I read about a newer concept called moral injury, which you should read up. It's interesting, which is the kind of, it's sort of like burnout. It happens to ER doctors, war correspondents, people who just see too much too consistently. And what you do as a war correspondent is you have a kind of controlled schizophrenia where when you see awful things, but you kind of have to keep it at arm's length, and you put up this kind of wall, and then you have the real you, which is but eventually, especially as you get older, the difficulty in keeping that, I'm going to change metaphors now, I mean, it's like a spring-loaded trapdoor, and you're keeping it down. The energy that's required to keep that trapdoor closed, you start to get tired, and it starts to creak open, and more of these sort of golems come out into you. And that's why a lot of people only start to exhibit both moral injury and PTSD as they get older, as I am doing, apparently.
We have been given an extra minute, so we do have 46 seconds. So we'll take one very short, quick. Oh, no, we have too many hands. Let them decide.
Hello. Thank you for the wonderful session. I have two questions to Priyanka ma'am. The first question is, yesterday I attended the session of Carl Penn. He's also a brown immigrant living in the USA as a Indian diaspora. So do you think that what you talked about, that, sorry, I need to crisp my question, that this brownness thing is there when parents have this fear that their children, when they choose different career paths like being actor or being writer, it is not being embarrassed about the children, but it is like fear that as a brown children they would not have that success.
I think it depends on the parent. I think some parents are very invested in what it looks like. And my parents were not worried about that. They were just worried about me having some stability in my life and having a job that would be reliable for a long time. As my father said, I can pick up my stethoscope and go anywhere, and he wanted that for me. So I think it took a little while for them to understand that I had something, a stable source of income. But they were not the kind to be embarrassed by me at all. But I know that there are some communities where that does happen.
We are all out of time. Thank you everyone for coming. This was a very frank, fun session. Yeah.